Yeah, we're at 25. Good. Okay, folks, I really apologize for the hiccup there. Hopefully we're all connecting. And you know what? The grant program is still here. So let's keep talking. All right. So let's move on to the next slide there, Michelle. And maybe the next one. We can go to the next one. I think we covered that material. So what does that mean in real dollars? If you look at the middle column, the white column, you can see the 12.9 million. That's what was allocated for this biennium. We are now in the second year of the biennium. So jump over to the far right, the blue column, and go to the bottom of the page. We have 6.3 million to work with this year. We've allocated 150,000 for planning grants, 922,000 for small grants, and 5.2 million for the large grant category. And when we say large and small, what does that mean? The small grant category is a maximum request of $75,000. The large grant category, we can go up to $750,000. We can go up to $1 million for land acquisitions. And in the small planning grant category, that maxes out at $40,000. Here's a table that has a lot of numbers, but what it does is it shows our averages over the last 3 years. If I can just kind of point you to the green block, if you look at the left side, the green block refers to large grants over the last 3 years. And in the middle of the page, we have small grants in the blue block, and then small planning grants in the peach colored block at the bottom. Now going back to the large grants in the green section, if I can just point you to the red font going across the screen, what this tells us that in the last 3 years, we've been able to fund 50% of the grant requests. The average award in that category has been $303,000. Moving down to the small grant category, what this tells us, looking at the red font moving across the page, we've been able to fund close to 85% of the grant requests within the small grant category. The average award in that category has been in the neighborhood of $55,000. In the planning grant category, we've been able to fund 92% of those requests, and the average award has been $32,000. So what's the takeaway from this? If you're submitting an application in the large grant category, you have about a 50-50 chance of being funded if history repeats itself. In the small grant category, you have about an 85% chance of being funded, and if you're submitting a planning grant, you have about a 92% chance of being funded. Next. One thing that I want to stress right off the bat here, that this is a reimbursement grant format. In other words, you need to have enough cash flow to initially pay for your project expenses to get the ball rolling. Once you've accumulated some bills, you can submit documentation of those bills and documentation confirming that those bills have been paid to us and request reimbursement. Then we will reimburse to you the percentage that we agreed to that we would. The eligible applicants to the local government grant program are cities, counties, parks and recreation districts, port districts, and metro. Now, if you're in the audience today and you're not necessarily associated with one of these agencies, that doesn't mean you can't participate. You can certainly be a helper. We've had situations in the past where Friends of the Park is passionate about improvements at their park, and they say, look, they approach their city and say, we'll take the ball and run with it. We'll kind of work on the application and pull some of the nuts and bolts together. But actually, one of these entities has to actually be the eligible applicant. There are matching requirements for based on population for each eligible applicant. There's a 50% match required for our larger cities and districts with a population greater than 25,000. For our medium cities, population between 5,000 and 25,000, there's a 40% match required. And for our smaller communities, under 5,000 in population, there is a 20% match required. When it comes to coming up with your match participation, you know, what's eligible? Well, certainly budgeted funds works really well. Cash always spends easy and it's easy to track. But we can also include other things too. You can have your agency labor and equipment is qualified to be part of your match participation. If you have some materials and supplies on inventory that can go toward the project, that is certainly eligible. You might benefit from other federal grants or some other community grants or even private donations. All these things can contribute to your match, to your project. If you have land within your inventory that you've held and you've purchased it within the last 6 years with the intent of adding to your park system, the value of that land can actually be used as match as well. It is very important that that value be substantiated by an appraisal and an appraisal review. If you do indeed have that land and you've put some planning into it, you've done some survey work or testing, or you've procured appraisals on that land, if you've done those items within the last 2 years, those costs can actually be attributed to your project budget as well. We do have a limit in that we can only accept up to 15% of pre-agreement costs in your project budget within the application. Now, you may have spent more than that, but we can only accept up to 15% of the total project cost in pre-agreement of planning costs. You might have some volunteer labor within your application and your project, and there's 2 ways to record volunteer labor rates and the value of those contributions. If you have skilled laborers within your project, say you have some heavy equipment operators or masons or skilled trade people, we'd recommend that you use BOLI rates to record their volunteer labor hours, so the value of their hours. If you have like friends of the park that are coming in to do invasive weed removal or plantings, we recommend that you use the wage rate established by the independentsector.org. Currently that rate is $25.40 an hour. We do have a requirement that you use one method or the other and not mix the 2 together. So you might want to look at your program up front. If you have volunteer hours that you plan to include in your project, is it predominantly skilled trades or is it predominantly friends of the park type people? And then plan your hourly rate that you would use for your value of labor accordingly. If you have any kind of materials and inventory that you can apply to your project, that is certainly eligible. We would just ask that you include those prices and those budget figures at a current fair market value. Same thing with your donated equipment. Most cities have a rental schedule or a rental value schedule, and that's what we would expect you to use for your hourly rate for any of your own equipment that you use. Okay, moving on to project types, and I'll just take a quick little break here. Okay, talking about project types, and I will just highlight this picture here. This is a really kind of a neat story in the city of Joseph, where the city organized the purchase of all the materials, and then they had some volunteer contractors that volunteered to give their expertise to the project. The community signed up on them over about 4 different Saturdays and came together and put this up in a whole community build type format. Neat project. Within the local government grant program, the types of projects that we can entertain are acquisitions of property, development, which in our mind is making something new, acquisition and development, and then rehabilitation, which is making something unusable back to usable, and then small planning grants. The operative words here are outdoor park and recreation areas. Those are the facilities that are eligible, and those facilities must be open and accessible to the public at large. Let's talk about acquisition projects. This can be for the acquisition of lands and lands around waters for recreation purposes. This can be new park properties or additions to your existing park. They can be open spaces for conservation. Pretty much anything that can be dedicated to public outdoor recreation. When it comes to acquiring property, it has to be substantiated with an appraisal. We have to have that baseline value established. If you are applying for purchase of property just within the local government grant program and you do not ever attend or plan to have federal dollars involved in the project, you can use just the Uniform Standards appraisal. If you at any point you think you're going to want to use federal dollars in that project, either now or in the future, then it is a requirement that you use the Uniform Appraisal Standards for federal land acquisitions, referred to as the Yellow Book appraisal. So that's something you want to look at up front and think about the future of the project. Once an appraisal has been initiated, then it is the responsibility of the applicant to arrange for a review appraisal. often referred to as a desk appraisal. And this is common within the industry, where appraiser number one will do the full-blown appraisal. Then they'll work in conjunction with an appraisal reviewer, and they will work alongside them or out immediately after the fact, and they will go through and examine their conclusions, and they'll write an opinion letter afterwards saying, yes, I concur with points A, B, and C. I might have an issue with D or whatever, and they might work that out together to where by the time we get an appraisal and a review appraisal at our end, they should pretty much agree. But that's the responsibility of the applicant to do to get both of those in the works. Both the appraisal and the appraisal review are due at time of application deadline. Those costs can indeed be put into your project budget and included as part of your match. Now, there might be an exception to this in some situations. Say you have a little sliver of property along an existing park, and you have the opportunity to buy that parcel and add it to your park and expand your park property. If it's kind of an odd piece and you think it's valued at less than $25,000, you can do this process, what we refer to as a waiver valuation. You can request from your local title company, from their customer service department, you can request comparables for that property, and then maybe work in conjunction with a qualified realtor in your area to draft an opinion letter on the value of the property based on those comps. If it's pretty much understood that the value of the property is under $25,000, you can submit that letter of valuation, and that way you don't have to go out and get a full-blown appraisal on a small, low-dollar value piece of property. We don't expect you to do that. So this is an option. You might have another situation within your community where a very desirable piece of property comes available, and you've kind of had your eye on it thinking, boy, if we could ever add that to our park system, that'd be great. It comes on the market, you know it's going to move quickly, and you say, you know what, we have got to jump on this now. If you find yourself in that situation, what you can do is shoot us a letter and explain exactly that, saying this is kind of a one-time opportunity, we need to move fast. We will shoot you back a letter saying, sure, go ahead and purchase that property, and then then you can plan on participating in the very next local government grant program go-around, hopefully for help on that acquisition. Now, this is your ticket to get into the next go-around. It doesn't necessarily guarantee that your project's going to be funded, but at least get you in the pool. So it is a method to consider. When you do an acquisition, if there's any kind of structures on the property, we are going to want to see an inventory of those and some sort of plan of how they might fit into some sort of recreational purpose down the road, outdoor recreation that is, or if they're going to be demolished. If we do kind of expect that the property remain in some form of outdoor recreation, to a certain extent while you're waiting to develop it, and then we would like to see development take place within 2 years after the acquisition. Okay, moving on to development projects, building something new. From our perspective, development projects create new outdoor recreation facilities in accordance with the SCORP, the State Comprehensive Outdoor Recreation Plan, comprehensive plans of your local community or your park's master plan, or some form of other local planning effort. And of course, this includes everything that you can think of that fits the outdoor recreation category: playfields, playground equipment, picnic shelters, trails, etc., etc. Now, in addition to what I've just mentioned, you can certainly include what we refer to as support facilities in your project. And by support facilities, that would be like roads, parking areas, restroom buildings, picnic shelters. And when I talk about restrooms, you might see this coming up later in our discussion. Only outdoor recreation facilities are eligible, but a restroom is what we consider a support facility to outdoor recreation. Because let's face it, if you're recreating in the great outdoors, what's more important than a restroom? That can help you stay outdoors longer. So yes, these are eligible. Moving on to rehabilitation projects. This is a pretty extreme example here. This was an old tired railroad trestle converted into a really nice pedestrian bridge in downtown Salem. When we think of major rehabilitation, it means bringing something back to its something that has run its regular life expectancy and is verging on obsolescence, bringing it back to usable function. Might also have to do with bringing it up to health and safety code, or bringing it up to requirements to meet Americans with Disabilities Act, or you might have changing recreational needs within your community. One example that we've seen of this in recent years is possibly restriping tennis courts to accommodate pickleball. In any kind of rehabilitation project, we do want to see pictures of what is being rehabilitated. And I'll just add a plug. You know what? We like to see pictures for everything. It's just extremely helpful in the applications. Small community recreation planning grants. This year we have $150,000 earmarked and available. The maximum planning grant award is $40,000. This is for our smaller communities, cities and districts with a population less than 10,000 in population, and counties with a population less than 50,000. There is a match requirement that's a little different within the planning grants. Cities and districts with a population between 10 and 5,000, they're required to come in with a 20% match. And am I getting that right? That's obscured a little bit there. There's a 40% match required for cities and districts with a population between 5 and 10,000. That first one was, I guess, the smaller communities was up to 5,000. Yeah. Eligible planning grant projects can be system-wide plans that if your community has 3 parks in it, you could have a plan that encompasses all 3 park properties, or it can be site-specific. It can focus on just one of those parcels, or it can relate to a community or regional trail system. In the sidebar of the application, we still have the 1317 SCORP Appendix A planning guide. Even though this has an older date on it, it's still relevant. We did not intend to update that. It's still a good planning guide to consult if you need to. When we think of planning projects, we think of projects that are going to use specialized consultants to help work with your local citizenry to come up with a site-specific or a community-wide or a trails-type plan. The idea being that the consultants would help you gather lots of public participation, and of course the goal would be to have a master plan that'll help guide future development. Now, as it relates to all of our projects that are not eligible would be indoor facilities, of course, with the exception of what I mentioned earlier, like bathrooms or a pool house to an outdoor pool complex. But indoor facilities in general, other than what I've just mentioned, are not eligible. We don't like to get into routine maintenance or repairs or professional type facilities that would be just for the use of, say, semi-professional athletics, something like that, exhibit areas, areas that would be kind of restricted to one particular group or sports league or organization. We don't get into acquisition of historic sites or helping school systems meet their minimum site size requirements. We feel that there are other buckets of money for those purposes. One thing that's very important within the program is that you must have control of your property. You neither need to own the property outright or have a lease for 25 years. If we're going to put money into your project, we want to see that benefit to the public go for many years to come. One thing that we don't want to see happen is we don't want to see a conversion of that property out of recreational use. And so that's why we have these long time windows. Okay, let's take a look at the scoring this year since it has revised a little bit. This year we are operating fully under the revised 2019-23 SCORP. And I've got a slide here that just became outdated as of last night. Since we just went to a new website we discovered this morning, and it seems to be working good. And the new SCORP is actually embedded right on the front page of our new grants page. So you don't need to go through this little process right here. We'll talk about that a little bit more. This is a summary of the new SCORP scoring points. They're pretty much the same as in previous years. Points 1, 2, and 3 related to the SCORP. Those points have been downgraded slightly, and we've added a few in other categories. One that we've added in particular to point out is point number 4, bicycle and pedestrian projects. That is one that we added in negotiation with the legislature and cooperation with ODOT. We have elevated bike and pedestrian trail projects a little bit with a separate scoring category this year. I'm going to just take a quick little break and check in with Michelle. How are we doing on questions? Hey, great. Thanks for your patience. We appreciate your questions along the way. We are looking at the question dialog box about the size of a postage stamp, so we appreciate your patience. For some of the longer questions, we may have to get back with you after the program today and respond to you in more detail. But anyway, we'll try to keep up here. So, referring to the new SCORP questions, they're going to be in a little bit different format this year. I think you'll find that there's going to be far more questions that go straight to just objective answers rather than a long narrative type answer. This year's application is kind of designed to have the narrative like in the first 4 questions, and then beyond that, you're going to be pointed to a lot of tables in the new SCORP. The new SCORP was conducted with a lot of extensive research and statistics this year, far more than the last version. And so that's what we're kind of referring to. And just by way of an example, here's the first question. Does your project address any of the statewide priorities identified in the new SCORP? If so, what needs are addressed? And it's going to point you directly to tables 12.1 and 12.2 on page 216 of the SCORP. Now the SCORP is embedded in the sidebar of the application, so it's going to be easy to access for you, but you will have to go back and forth. And those tables 12.1 and 12.2 refer to public recreation provider identified needs throughout the state, whatever their survey said, and then Oregon resident identified needs. So ideally, your project will land within one of those categories. So let's go to the next slide and take a look at that actual table. So this is what that table is going to look like, and frankly, it's what a lot of the tables are going to look like. So as you can see, the top category there, the top rows, have to do with the Oregon Public Provider Survey results, and then the bottom table, table 12.2, refers to the Oregon Resident Outdoor Recreation Survey results. On the left, this is the categories for close to home priorities, and on the right is dispersed area or rural area priorities. So depending on your jurisdiction and where you are, so if you're in the close to home category and you're an Oregon provider, well, the Oregon Provider Survey says that what they think is needed throughout the state is more community trail systems, restrooms, children's playgrounds areas, picnic shelters, trails connected to public lands, picnicking and day use facilities. The slides of this presentation will be available today. We are recording this and we will post this to our website so you can refer back to it at your convenience. Okay, question number 2, moving on. It's going to be the same kind of format. Does the project address any of the following 4 issues? Now this is the first one was priorities. This was issues now in the new SCORP, and if so, what needs are addressed? And again, this is going to point you to tables 12.3 through 12.20. So now we're talking about 17 different tables that you're going to look at. And the statewide issues that they've highlighted here are an aging population, an increasingly diverse population, families with children, and low-income populations. So let's look at the next slide, and we'll take just a sampling of some of these tables. Now, some of these results might not be what you're expecting. What they've identified here is within the young-old population, and the young-old is now termed as age 60 to 75, I believe it is. These counties are flagged as having an increasing population in the young-old population. So if your project falls within one of these counties, that's what you can say as an answer, is that yes, our project is helping to meet young-old population priorities, provided your project is actually meeting those needs. And then the next one down refers to the young-old population within priority urban growth boundaries. So there's different communities listed here. So you might fall in one of those targeted communities. And then in the bottom table, it refers to the middle-old population priorities. And then this goes on, there's a number of different categories, a number of different tables. So chances are your project is going to land in one of these priorities at some point, but you will have to go through these tables carefully and see how your project lines up with these issues. Okay. Local needs and benefits looks real similar to the way it did last year. There are tables again that are going to, the question will point you to the county level recreation provider identified survey results and also the Oregon resident survey results. So hopefully your project will hit one of those priorities within the county or the very localized survey results. As before, we want to see, does your project land in some sort of a local planning document or a parks master plan? And if not there, did it arise out of some sort of public workshop, public meeting, etc.? And then we've added a fifth layer this year. This parkland mapping process is just one more tool that you can use to substantiate your project. There's the address on how to get to it at the bottom of the screen there, but it's also embedded as a link in the side of the application for easy access for you. And if we can go to the next screen and kind of take a look at what this looks like, and this is something that we did in conjunction with Portland State University, and we invited all park providers throughout the state to inventory their park systems, give us a list of those, and then to give us an inventory of all the park amenities. And then Portland State put together all these various overlays, and you can see all the different overlays on the left sidebar that you can check. And so you can look at your community, and in this case, I've zoomed in on Salem, and I'm interested in, well, where's all of our parkland, and how far are the park properties from different communities? So if we can look at the next slide, I've checked, you can see the box that I've checked over on the far left is 1/2 mile to the nearest park. So what I'm asking here is, out of all of our citizenry, how many people are within 1/2 mile of a park? Well, I can see that there's some voids in our overlays. So I go, okay, well, I notice that there's a box right below the one I've checked that says 1/2 mile to the nearest park that's associated with a school. So let's check that one and go to the next screen. So now I've got this yellow overlay as well. It kind of expands the footprint a little bit, but I've still got some pockets. So I noticed that kind of right in the lower middle section of the screen, I do know that that's Salem Airport. So we really don't need any park properties there, but moving just a little bit up to Kitty Corner to the north and to the right, there seems to be sort of an unserved area. So let's zoom in on that. Now this shows me Lancaster Drive, and I know that that's a highly commercial corridor, but there does seem to be residential side areas to both sides of that. Now, if I was a city planner or a parks planner, and I'm thinking, we want to make sure that all of our citizens are within 1/2 mile of a park, this might be a pocket that I'm looking at, and if that was my goal, I could print this, turn it in with my application, and say, look, we have an underserved area, we need park property in this area, and this is where we're anticipating putting a new park. So that's just an illustration of this parkland mapping tool and how you might use it to further substantiate your project. If you look over to the left sidebar at the very bottom where it says SCORP population distribution layer, if I open that up, that opens up dozens more layers on demographics, ethnic diversity and distribution, weight body index layers. There's quite a collection of information there that you can use. Okay, moving on to a couple other questions here. We do have this new question here about bike and pedestrian trail projects. That's a 5-point score. This is pretty much similar to past years. This has always been a priority within the local government grant program. However, I'll point you to point D on this where it says alternative transportation routes. In the past, we've always prioritized bike and ped paths that had a recreational purpose. We're kind of opening the gate a little wider this year to include alternative transportation routes as well in our cooperation with ODOT. The physical activities benefit question, in the past, their question was, does your project help get people out and moving? Well, this year it's related more closely to some of the survey results and these tables again in SCORP. So again, you'll have to refer back to these tables, and this is where you're going to want to look for how your project lines up with this table data. Major rehabilitation, we've touched on that already, just bringing something from kind of a state of disrepair back up to its usable state. It can also mean bringing something up to standards for the Americans with Disability Act and changing recreational needs like we touched on earlier.
That's not one of your new restrooms, is it?
Well, I just noticing that anyone can clearly see that the door on that restroom, you cannot get a wheelchair through that door. So that's out of compliance. We'd like to see community support for your project, and that's usually demonstrated with support letters. We'd like to see 4 or 5 support letters. And you know what? The support letters that go the farthest are from letters from actual users. Those are always the nice ones to get. If you have any kind of survey data that you can include with your application, that might be helpful as well. When we're looking at financial commitment, we want to see, does your agency budget demonstrate financial commitment? Do you really have the funds already earmarked in your budget for your project? Is your agency match secure? We will ask you to submit a resolution to apply for a grant that clearly states that the financial commitment is there for the current project and for funding the project out into the future. There are a couple of questions in this application, again, related to accessibility. The first question is just basic accessibility. Does it meet accessibility? Are the facilities accessible? And then also in relation to demographic groups. So we see this in the context of age as well. Does your project include benches for respite for elderly as on a walking trail, things like that. We will ask if your agency has a completed ADA transition plan, and it's either a yes or no question. If you do not, we also have some accessibility assessment tools embedded in the application for self-assessment that you can use on your own. We don't necessarily need to see a response on that, but we just want to know that you've either have a transition plan or you've done some self-assessment on your own. This question number 10, universal design concepts, takes us a little bit farther, and we give you an opportunity to describe, does your project include considerations that kind of go beyond ADA? In other words, have you really taken some time to try to design for universal design access? So just with very simple design elements, does that make your project accessible and inviting to any number of types of people, regardless of their physical abilities or their cognitive abilities? It's just kind of an added one step beyond just general accessibility accommodations. We do have a number of tools embedded in the application to help you along the process. We have the application instructions, online application instructions. Of course, the manual is embedded in the application, and I strongly encourage you to go through the manual because there's a wealth of information there. And of course, there is the new SCORP version, and then there's the SCORP planning guide as well. I'm sure many of you are already familiar with oprdgrants.org. I kind of think of that as kind of the back door to our grants program. I think it's the easiest. We just launched a new website overnight, and the address is there, and that's kind of the front door, which will take you right to our grant programs. But you can get to all of our grant materials and the online application system from either of these, no problem. There are a number of required attachments when you complete your application. Then you're going to be faced with a list of checkoff boxes, and you're going to need to submit something in every one of these checkoff boxes in order for your application to be able to be submitted. If you're missing something, the application won't submit. So your goal will be to change all of these little checkoff boxes from a red exclamation point to a green check mark. We like maps. We like to see a vicinity map. You know, where is your project in relation to your city, or where is it in relation to the county, something like that. We want to see an urban growth boundary map. We want to see a more focused in project site map of the footprint of the project itself. Our State Historic Preservation Office is going to want to see a 7.5-minute USGS topography map or a 1 square mile map that shows distinct geographic features so they can pinpoint your project area in their database. If you have construction plans, great. If you have concept drawings, great. You'll want to submit those. That'll indicate to us that your project is fairly well ready to go. We do have an environmental assessment packet that includes a couple of different pages for you to work with, and we'll touch on that a little bit more. Included in that is a state agency review form, and there's 3 particular state agencies that will want you to contact to review your project, depending on what type of project it is. We'll ask you to submit a land use compatibility form checked off by the right people, a resolution to apply for a grant checked off by your city council or your board of commissioners. We do like to see photos of the project site. That helps us a ton. And if you're doing any kind of an acquisition project, we will need to see an appraisal, an appraisal review, proof of a willing seller, and a title report from the title company. As I just mentioned, the environmental assessment and checklist packet has a number of different documents in it. That's embedded in the application. We would like you to download that, complete it, and re-upload it to your application. You'll want to include your project description and a map of your project site, like I just touched on. The State Historic Preservation Office will want to see a topography map, or if you don't have access to that, at least a 1 square mile Google Earth map, as long as it clearly shows roads or rivers or other geographical features. That should work. And then you will include a blank state agency review form that you will shoot off to 3 state agencies, including State Lands, Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, and Department of Environmental Quality, provided you're having some sort of ground disturbing activity. If you have no ground disturbing activity, you might not need to consult with these, but along with the contact list that we provide in the application, in each one of these categories, it will list a little collection of criteria that you'll want to be sure and be aware of to make sure that your project either does or does not need to go to one of these agencies for review. Along in that checklist, there's also a myriad of other state agencies that you may want to consult depending on the type of project you have. If you're doing anything that might involve the State Marine Board, you'll want to contact them. So, we have a whole collection of other state agencies that might be relevant for you, but these are the 3 main ones that are required. Now, there always seems to be a little bit of confusion about this last one here. The State Historic Preservation Office, we will submit your application to them for you if your project is selected for funding. But within the checklist of required documents, there are 2 documents that they're like cover pages for SHPO, that we will ask you to complete and submit. That way, if your project is selected for funding, we use those cover sheets to submit your project to SHPO. So you will be completing 2 forms for the State Historic Preservation Office, but you do not need to contact them directly. We'll take care of that for you. As I mentioned earlier, we will ask in the application, does your agency have an ADA transition plan? If you do, yes, great, you'll answer yes to that. If not, we just ask that you use our self-assessment tools embedded in the application to do a self-assessment on your project, and just let us know that you've done that self-assessment. Like I mentioned earlier, we will ask you to do a land use compatibility statement. You'll want to include any kind of construction or concept plans along with that and get that signed off by the right planning department. If you are doing anything that involves the Army Corps of Engineers, I'm sure you're aware that you need to get a pretty good long head start on that, because that will be a timely process. If you've done an appraisal on the property that you're hoping to include in an application, if you've done that appraisal within the last 12 months, or maybe even a little bit longer under some circumstances, that appraisal can still be relevant. We do ask that you include an appraisal review as well. We want to see a letter substantiating proof of a willing seller. And then if you do an acquisition, we do expect something to happen development-wise on that property within 2 years of the acquisition. We would like you to submit all these documents digitally, particularly the appraisals, because those can be lengthy. And we do need to have an appraisal and an appraisal review along with the application at time of application. Within the application, you will build a project budget, and our recommendation is that you not be too brief, but you don't need to be too detailed either. We don't need to know all the nuts and bolts, but you don't want to be too brief. We don't want to see just one line item that says construction 500,000. We want to see sufficient line items to kind of show the major work elements and to tell the story of your project. When you build the budget, you'll have the opportunity to identify how much of each line item is coming from match, if it's going to be just from cash from your budget, or labor, or donated equipment, so forth. We also ask that you not include a line item that is titled only contingency. You can have contingency built into your budget, but we want those dollars spread out throughout the entire budget. We don't want just one line item for $10,000 contingency, because basically that tells us that there's $10,000 there that's kind of a wild card. It doesn't really seem to have a home. So we want every dollar to have a home, no contingency line items, please. When you log on to the online application system, this is what you'll see. This is the first page you'll come to. And if you have an account, you can go directly to the sign-in in the upper right. If you do not, you'll want to, down the very last line toward the bottom left, there's an underline there that says this link. You want to click on that to apply for an access to the application system. If you do have an account, or once you do have an account, you can log in, and this is the first screen you'll come to. And the red button there will always show any available applications that are ready for applicants to use. All of our grant systems use the same applications, so at any given time there's probably a collection of applications there, both from the recreation grant side and then also from our historic side, the heritage side. They operate a number of grant systems as well, or grant processes as well, so their applications will be there too. The next bar down shows where it says 16 applications. Obviously, this is kind of my in-house screenshot here, so there's going to be far more numbers here than what you probably have in your area. But the applications are the live applications that you are working with or you've worked on in the past. Once an application has been turned into a project, however, it jumps down to the Projects tab, the next one down. And then the bottom line shows 5 people. Those are the people within your organization that have access to the online grant system. Once an application has been submitted, we run it through a technical review in our shop, and we check to make sure that everything is, we look at your past performance and compliance to make sure that your jurisdiction is up to speed with any past grant processes. We check to make sure the application is complete and reasonably filled out, has a reasonable budget. The budget tells a good financial story of the project and has an appropriate scope of work. And we make sure all the attachments are included or the appropriate attachments are there. Is there public support demonstrated? Another thing we look for is the project really ready to go. Once we have completed our technical review, we shoot the application off to our 11-member advisory committee, and you can see the list here of the different representation areas that we have for our advisory committee. Then they begin their critique and review of your application. Typically, the Local Government Grant Program Advisory Committee meets in June. We entertain all the large grant requests greater than $75,000. And those applicants come before the advisory committee and make their presentations. The committee scores each project, and then those scores are averaged, and then we come up with a priority ranking list. Basically, you have a ranking list. We don't say yes or no to any projects for the most part. It's just a ranking list, and then we line that up against the dollars that we have available to work with. Applicants applying for a grant greater than $75,000 must do a presentation before the committee. You'll have 20 minutes for your setup time, presentation, and then to answer questions. We recommend allowing 7 to 10 minutes for questions. That's oftentimes the most valuable part of your presentation. That's your time to highlight anything that's unique about your project. Committee members will have already reviewed your application, so the presentation time is when you'll want to point out the great features of your project. PowerPoint or Prezi presentations are optional. They're not required, but they're certainly recommended because everyone does them. PowerPoint presentations need to be submitted to our office 1 week before presentation time. This is a couple of years ago. This is what your presentation session might look like. The small grant category, those requests less than $75,000 and the planning grant requests do not need to make a presentation before the committee. Those applications are scored separately by an in-house committee. Here's kind of a timeline of our program. We're at the second line down right now, doing a webinar in February. The large grant category, large grant apps are due April 1st. and then they immediately begin into their technical review. Small grant applications are due May 1st. Planning grant applications are due May 15th. Now, I will point out that when you look at the applications in the online grant system, when you open up a new application, it'll have a due date on the application. We can only enter in one date at a time. So right now, all those applications say April 1st. So don't be thrown by that if you're doing a small grant application. Once we pass the April 1st date line, then we'll change the next due date to May 1st for the small grant applications. So we'll do that one immediately, most likely on April 2nd. So don't be swayed by that in the meantime. In June, we will have our local government grant program advisory committee here in Salem. And then during July and August, we'll deal with the small grant applications and the planning grant applications. September, we'll package everything up and send it to Oregon State Parks Commission, which is like our board of directors, for their final review and approval. And then in October, we should be able to shoot agreements out to everyone for their review and signing. You would send that back to us. We will sign it, send it back to you along with a notice to proceed letter. It's very important to remember, do not start any project work until you have received a notice to proceed letter from us. You will have about a 2-year window to complete your project, but please wait for that notice to proceed letter to do anything that costs money that you want to get reimbursed for. You will have some responsibilities as a grantee. We do want to see progress reports submitted quarterly or at least every 6 months. Quarterly would be nice. 6 months is the requirement. You will want to keep accurate records of all your expenses. Ideally, you will assign a project accounting code within your accounting department. So at some point down the road, you can just punch in that code and hit go in your accounting system, and you can kick out all of the expenses and the checks paid on that project for reporting purpose. That'll make your request for reimbursement process a whole lot easier and smoother. You'll also want to track any staff time that gets used as match toward the project, and particularly any volunteers. You want to keep volunteer timesheets. If you have some mechanism on your own to do that, great. If not, we have examples of volunteer timesheets on our website as well that you can use. Same thing for donating materials and supplies or donated equipment. When it comes time to submit a request for reimbursement, we'll want to see copies of all your project bills and or invoices, and then also confirmation that those bills have indeed been paid. We must have that information as well. Hopefully you can just produce this with an accounts paid report. If that's not an option for you, we will need to see copies of canceled payment checks with the account numbers blocked out. You will indeed have a 2-year window to complete your project. If you run into some sort of a snag, let us know early. Amendments and extensions are possible, but not necessarily guaranteed. So please communicate with us if you think you might need an extension of any sort or any kind of change to the project. As may seem obvious that project areas and our facilities must meet ADA requirements. Another thing I've added here is plan for staff transitions. Within every grant cycle, there's going to be a couple of people that are going to get a new job opportunity or retire or move on. What we ask is that you plan for that, and whoever your successor is, please clue them in on what this process is. Let them know where the website is. Let them know what the reimbursement request situation is. In every grant cycle, it seems like we'll have a transition somewhere, and then I'll get a reimbursement request where someone just presents me with a bunch of receipts and says, here, you're going to pay this, right? And that's not the way it works. So please plan for any kind of transition. Once your project is completed, if you want to add some sort of an acknowledgement sign of your own, that's great. If not, we will be happy to send you one of ours. We would like to see some sort of acknowledgement at the project site for the local government grant program participation. Just kind of some basic common sense responsibilities here. We expect that the property will be maintained so that it's attractive and inviting to the public. Want it to be safe for public use, kept in reasonable repair, and open to the public, reasonable hours, reasonable times of the year, according to the type of facility that it might be. Any project where local government grant program money has been involved in the project, and we want to see that recreational use stay in place for at least 25 years. If we've helped you acquire property, we want that property to stay in recreation use for perpetuity. We will ask that a notice of grant be recorded right along with the new deed for any property required, stating that that property will stay in recreational use for perpetuity. What we don't want to see is a conversion, which would be the act of converting property funded through local government grant program funds out of outdoor recreational use. If that happens, then, and sometimes that does, we realize there's some unforeseeable situations, but that property must be replaced with other property of equal to or greater recreational value. Just our final admonition to you here is that, like I said earlier, in the large grant pool, you've got a 50-50 chance of being funded. There are no bad applications. There's no bad projects. They're all great. We wish we could fund them all, but we've only got limited funds to work with. Some projects actually get selected for funding after the second or maybe even the third try. If you would like feedback on how your project was scored, just let us know after the advisory committee meeting, and we can provide a certain degree of feedback for you. Oftentimes, the advisory committee offer good insights and good feedback, and it really is helpful on maybe the second go around if you want to try again. Okay, how are we doing on questions, Michelle?
I have some questions. Some I will read out loud because I think it'll be beneficial for the group to hear. So several people want to know, Mark, if you'll email them the slides after this. I believe they're available. I don't know if you're emailing them out.
If you want the slides of this, well, we will post the slides on our website. But if you would actually like to have them emailed to you, we can give that a shot. I think I can reduce it to a PDF, which might reduce the size appropriately enough. I'm not sure if we can get it down size-wise enough to make that work, but hey, we can give it a shot. So yeah, feel free to email me. We'll give it a shot.
The next question, I believe that what they're getting at is how many grant applications can you have at a time? So the question is, can an entity apply for multiple cycles? They have a current grant project in place and they want to apply for another one for a different project.
At OPRD, we run a wide range of grant opportunities, and you are welcome to apply to any and all of them. The one restriction that we do have is within the local government grant program, you cannot have two, or you can have a maximum of 2 local government grant program projects active at any given time. If you have 2 active, you cannot apply for another one until one of those completes.
I have a couple questions that may be better answered with a phone call or email to you, but one of the questions was if an acquisition project falls within the definition of close to home and dispersed area, which that can happen with a development project as well. How do you address that?
I see that as somewhat of a non-issue. Just kind of pick whatever you think is common sense on that. Acquisition projects are going to fall a little bit outside of some of the SCORP criteria, possibly. I'm just kind of winging this. You're going to want to come up with other criteria to substantiate your project. Do you think of anything else, Michelle?
Yeah, I think maybe one way to do it is look at what the close to home and the dispersed area benefits are. You should probably, if you're checking boxes throughout the application, stick with one or the other. I would say you have an opportunity in the narrative section to say this covers both, and here's why I think I'm answering these questions this way. So it's kind of up to you, but I would just justify your rationale in your narrative.
Sure, sounds good.
And then another question about acquisition projects, is the environmental assessment checklist required?
It is not. That's a good point. There's no ground disturbing activity on that, so those folks really don't need to weigh in at this point. As a matter of fact, they would prefer not to weigh in. They would prefer only to deal with files that involve them directly. So correct, that is not a requirement for an acquisition project.
So Mark, are you able to review grants before the deadline or parts of the grant?
I'm going to say a qualified yes. We can see grants as they are being formed, and we can take a peek at them. The challenge is that there's usually we receive between 30 and 40 and sometimes 50 grant applications, so the volume is pretty high. But if there's something that you would like us to take a particular look at, yes, we can consider doing that.
Let's see. In demonstrating compliance with SCORP criteria, the grant application prompts proposals to identify whether the improvement meets certain population provider survey priorities. In responding to the prompt, do we need to explain how a project meets the priority needs, or just identify which priority needs are met?
At this point, I would say at least a baseline, you would just need to say which priority needs are being met. Yes, that is correct. You can elaborate to a certain degree on how those needs are met. Certainly, that would be acceptable. And I think there is room in the answer boxes to actually put a little bit of a description as well. So I think basically the answer to your question is yes and yes.
Yeah, and if you want to go into further detail, if you really feel like you're hitting the mark on these SCORP criteria, you can write a little bit of that into your narrative areas.
Certainly.
Also on the attachments, somebody had a question about if the EA isn't required, then I heard that attachments, all these attachments have to be uploaded. There are separate applications for each type of project. So the attachments are going to reflect the application. So if it's an acquisition project and it's a attachment that's required for a development project, you wouldn't see that required as an uploadable document.
That's a good point, Michelle. Each application has a little different flavor, and the attachments required on each type of application are going to be a little bit different and more tailored to that type of application. You raise up another good point, though, and that's in some situations and a particular attachment just may not be relevant for your project, and in that case you can upload just a Word document or a PDF basically just saying not applicable, and that will allow you to check off that box, that attachment category, because you will have to have something in every attachment slot in order for the application to be submitted. So yes, you can put up just a placeholder if it is not relevant, but when we look at it, of course, we're going to want to make sure that yes, that attachment was indeed not relevant and not actually something that you really need to include.
Yeah, you don't want to say not applicable when
it really is.
It is.
Exactly.
Because we do get those, and we will be sending that right back.
Right.
Let's see, we've got a couple other questions. So I think Mark did address this. There's a question about if a city or an entity does not have an ADA transition plan in place. There is a self-evaluation form that is available. I think we have either a link or it might be embedded into the application.
Basically what it is, our accessibility department here has created some very nice handy little single page handouts and tools that can be used to self-assess your facilities, and they're embedded in the application sidebar. And I believe it's one is just a one pager on the requirements for a parking spot, for a handicap parking spot. Another one is a one-page handout on the measurements and requirements for a restroom. So they're just a real handy little tool. So if I'm guessing you probably have tools at your access as well. The bottom line here is either you have an ADA transition plan or that you've taken these accessibility planning tools at least into consideration in your particular project site.
How would OPRD like us to demonstrate past grant performance and compliance within the grant application prompt? Key information points?
What most applicants do, and we're totally comfortable with this response, is when they list basically saying that we have been on time and on point and on budget with our past applications. And if you want to go ahead and list a few of those, you're certainly welcome to. I guess what we'd be looking for here is if you did have an issue, or if you have an ongoing issue with a particular project that's still ongoing, you just be transparent with that and tell us, and Also identify any points you've been taking to remediate that. So anything else you'd add to that?
Yeah, I would also add one of the things that we see in that answer box is we have never received any past OPRD grants.
That's true too.
And a lot of times that's not true, and so that doesn't look very good for you if you're not, aware of your past grants. All of your past grants should be in your oprdgrants.org account. As Mark showed earlier, there's a panel that is for your applications, and there is a panel that shows your projects, and those are all past projects that you have through all of our grant programs. So before you answer that question about past performance, make sure that you're aware of the past grants that you have.
That's a good point. And now that we've had this online grant system functional for a number of years now, that really does give you easy access to your past history by looking at your past projects. In the past, when it was all paper, it was all kind of sort of dependent on you to keep good paper files and to rifle back through them. But you don't have to do that anymore for at least the last 6 or 7 years. So.
Okay, so here's a question about how would you address applying for or getting applying criteria number 7, which is for major rehabilitation when you're just doing a development. And I think I can answer that in saying you wouldn't get the points for it being a rehabilitation project if it's not.
That is correct.
Okay, let's see. There's a question about how straightforward it would be to copy the application in the online grant system to create a template in Word. And I think that's probably for the purposes of maybe having a way to address the narrative questions and type them out first before you copy and paste them into the application.
Sure, whatever tools you want to use at your end to make that work, that's certainly fine. In the past, we have had pre-application worksheets available that would allow applicants to get into the application even when there wasn't an active application available. Kind of gave you a big running start, or you could work on it in the off season. In this situation where we have just now created new applications, the new application is live. So you can either work directly in that, or if you want to create some sort of a workaround to work in an alternative format like a Word document, that's great. Sure.
Yeah, you should be able to copy and paste it or make a PDF out of it. If you have some, if you need some guidance to how to do that, you can always give Mark a call and he could probably walk you through it. But I think it is pretty straightforward. More questions about the presentation and link to this recording. Those will be made available. I think we'll have some editing probably to do to the to this webinar, and then it'll eventually be available to you.
That's true. Our experience in the past is that we have to pass this off to our IT folks who have to kind of jump through some hoops to actually convert it to a format that they can get it to a YouTube. And apparently it's not a very fast process. But eventually we'll try to get this posted to our website, and previous year's webinars are still on our website actually, and the information by and large is still applicable. I mean, this one is obviously updated for the new SCORP criteria, but past webinars are still relevant as well.
So Mark, there's a question about pre-agreement planning costs and can they be used as match for all project types? And we do allow pre-agreement planning costs for development rehabilitation. With an acquisition, there shouldn't be any planning costs because it's not a development project, but the cost for the appraisals and the appraisal review, if that happens before the grant, which we expect it to, exactly, can be used as match.
Right. Yep.
Oh, and I answered that question, and the person already utilized the manual, which, as Mark said, is very handy. But some of these questions I think are helpful to the whole group. I think we have a couple of questions left on here that might be pretty specific to just those projects. So I think what I'll do is have Mark, we'll keep these questions on here if you're not getting your question answered, and we'll have Mark follow up with you after this. And if for some reason we didn't capture your question totally, then certainly feel free to email or call.
Certainly. And if for some reason we've missed your question and we don't get back to you in a timely manner, feel free to shoot me an email. I'd be more than happy to respond. If we can we move to the next screen that shows our contact information? There's our contact information, my email in particular. And if you have any follow-up questions, feel free to give me a call, shoot me an email. Thank you again so much for taking time out of your day, and we look forward to hearing from you. With that, we will sign off. Thanks much and have a good day.